What would happen if the Neanderthals never went extinct? Yet, due to misconceptions about the Neanderthals, before we can start this timeline, I have to debunk some myths about the Neanderthals. Most people view Neanderthals as a classic caveman, brutish, primitive, and barbaric, but this is inaccurate, and Neanderthals were actually quite advanced for their time, and I'll explain how later on. The Neanderthal brain size is actually slightly larger than the human brain size, and although this doesn't mean a lot, it probably functions similar to the human brain, and the Neanderthals actually invented ceremonial burial before humans did, and their stone tools were better at hacking than human tools were at that time. Also, humans mated with Neanderthals, and the average Eurasian has between 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA, and the difference between Neanderthals and humans genetically is 0.12%. So if Neanderthals were so advanced, why did they go extinct? For three main reasons. First of which is that due to the Neanderthal bone structure and having heavier bones than humans, they couldn't run as fast or for as long as humans could. Also, humans had inventions such as the javelin, which meant they could kill prey at a distance, while Neanderthals still had to get close to kill their prey. And third, and likely most importantly, humans should eat about 2,000 calories a day of a variety of foods to be healthy, whilst meanwhile Neanderthals should eat 4,000 calories a day to be healthy, 80% of which should be meat. Another possible reason was that as Neanderthals had to eat so much food, their hunting ranges would be quite large, and the Neanderthal population would be quite low, so Neanderthals likely infrequently come up and meet each other. And so, when the humans come up from the tropical south with tropical diseases, it would kill the Neanderthals in cold Europe in exponential numbers. In this timeline, somehow, the Neanderthals are able to not be outcompeted by humans, and thus survive in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. How would a world where Neanderthals and humans vied for control of the Earth to this day be different? What would the world be like? That is the question of this alternate history. Geographically, Europe would likely be firmly Neanderthal. North Africa and the Middle East, as well as Central Asia, would likely be part Neanderthal, part human, whilst the rest of the Old World would likely be strongly human. As 80% of the Neanderthal diet was land-based meat, that would mean they wouldn't fish a lot, and so they would likely have very poor naval techniques, and so humans would likely settle the Americas. Also, for this reason, the Native Americans likely continue to control the Americas, as Europe and the Neanderthals would be very primitive at sailing. As 80% of the Neanderthal diet would be meat, that would mean that when farming would be invented, the Neanderthals would likely not pick up farming, because what use is grain when 80% of your diet is meat? The Neanderthals instead would likely be nomadic herders, as the animals would provide meat that the Neanderthals would eat, and riding the horses would compensate for the Neanderthals being slower than their human adversaries. And so the Europe of this timeline would likely have more in common with Central Asia than it would with the Europe of our timeline, as nomadic tribes would likely dominate Europe. Similarly to the Mongols and the Huns and the Avars and tribes of their ilk, the Neanderthals likely found nomadic empires across Central Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa during the medieval and classical periods. Meanwhile, the Neanderthals inhabiting Europe, the western branch of the Indo-Europeans, would likely have stayed in Central Asia, and so tribes like the Celts and the Germans would likely have stayed in Central Asia. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the farming nations, due to technology advances, would have many advances over the nomadic Neanderthals. For example, mass-drilled infantry gunpowder formations would render horse archers redundant, and large cities would mean that the farming nations could muster much larger armies than the Neanderthals. In the 19th century, the farming lands of the Middle East would likely conquer Europe and carve it up similar to how the Europeans did in our timeline with Africa, with different Middle Eastern nations claiming different parts of Europe. The only Neanderthal lands to survive would likely be the Scandinavian peninsula and Britain due to their distance from the Middle East and how they're cut off from the rest of Europe. Overall in this timeline, the Middle East and not the Western powers will likely be the most powerful region in the world. As Europe is quite fertile and Neanderthals wouldn't be farming Europe, the Middle Eastern powers likely move settlers into Europe in this timeline to farm it. As the farmers and the native nomads would likely have conflicting interests, Europe would likely be a very violent region in this timeline, and as both groups fought for supremacy. With Europe out of the picture, and the Middle East showed very little signs of having industrial revolution in our timeline, one can assume that in this timeline, the Industrial Revolution would have likely not happened, or would have happened much later than it did in our timeline. Technology in this timeline would likely be 200 years behind what it was in our timeline, and so a battle in the 21st century would likely look like something out of the Napoleonic Wars. As without the Industrial Revolution and without intervention from the Western powers, Japan would likely remain isolationist and not look out to the world, and so would likely not be the superpower it is today. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please comment or subscribe. What if Altist? Thank you for watching.